Okay.
So I'm kind of excited this week because I did a little extra research. I couldn't tell you that I'd ever really studied Ezra and Nehemiah much, um, but they're very interesting books. I'm gonna in a minute. I'm gonna check to see how many times they come up in the lectionary, how many times we hear them in church. But I'm guessing very little, if at all. And yet, they may be some of the most historically significant books in the whole Bible. And here's why.
Yes.
Um, they're historically significant because they parallel real life events that we know from history outside biblical sources, and and they have the most detail on those things. So primarily, and Ezra and Nehemiah are sort of like Luke Acts. If some people refer to Luke Acts as one book, uh, because we think it was written by the same author, and it's a continuation of one from the other. Ezra and Nehemiah are kind of like that. Some people refer to them as like one book. It may not have been the same author, but some people think it could have been. And they go one after the other. So it's more about a continuous line of history separated by the two most important figures among the people in that time. So it's only divided by the people and the time, the period. If you guys remember last week when we finished Kings and talked about Chronicles, the big important figure at this point, at the end of those readings, the beginning of this reading, is Cyrus, uh,
Right.
who was the Persian Empire who conquered Babylon and then freed the slaves. So this is the best, not the only, but because there's a little bit in Isaiah and Jeremiah, but from the perspective of a prophet, it's a different kind of story. This is the story of the rebuilding of Israel after the exile in Babylon. Um,
I'll be right back. I got to go get my glasses.
yeah, sure. So I find this really fascinating for that reason, that we kind of get a little bit of the rebuilding of Israel in Isaiah and Jeremiah and a couple of the prophets, but we don't get it from a historical perspective. So
Right.
that makes this I think fascinating, to see, well, what, because I've had these questions myself, like they're gone for a couple generations. All of the landowners, the leaders, are gone for a couple generations, and then they come back and claim their land from the people that were behind. That had to be a difficult time. It's not just rebuilding what was torn down, but rebuilding the society and restoring ancestral land to people, to descendants of people, not even to the actual people. um, it's an interesting thing. Um, so
Yeah.
so this covers from about 515. So the exile happens. The Babylon exile starts around 600 BC, and the temple is destroyed in 586 BC. So anywhere between 606 and 586 is when people are brought into exile. So that 20-year period. And then this is somewhere around 515. So 70 years later is when Ezra and Nehemiah begin to be written. So the 70 years later, the slaves are released from captivity in Babylon, and Ezra and Nehemiah talk about um, what happens next. What happens when 2 generations later everyone's restored to the land in Israel. It's I think that's fascinating, because it's not that everything in the Bible has to be directly connected with historical events, but we have historical events that connect directly to these books that we don't have in a lot of other places in Scripture. So that makes it really, like, we know when the temple was rebuilt. We know when the slaves were, as I talked about last week about the Cyrus cylinder. We know when Cyrus proclaimed the slaves to be free. We have hard dates for those things, so it's really neat to see this perspective of what was the rebuilding like. Um, it's written from the perspective of 2 leaders. Ezra was a Jewish priest, kind of basically the first Jewish priest uh, after the restoration of the exiles. And Nehemiah was not a priest, but more a governor of the people in Judea, after the exile. And
Yeah.
both of them had a lot of, neither one of them, like we often hear these stories from the perspective of the prophets. This is not the same as that. It's really a history book, not a prophet book. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you read the style of the writing of the
Yeah.
prophet books, like I said,
I noticed that. I noticed that. It was more history.
Isaiah and Jeremiah are prophets, and they talk about what happened after the people returned from exile, but they talk about it from a different style of writing, right? They talk about it from the prophet style of writing, where this is more historical. So it's interesting. I was optimistic we could maybe read all of Ezra in 1 week. I think it'll take 2 weeks. But there are a lot of names that we're gonna skip, but still it's about 10 chapters, 10, 11 chapters. So I'm gonna read the first
Can
chapter.
I say something real quick?
Yeah.
When we were reading the let's see, was it the Kings? When we were reading Kings, or was it? Anyway, the one that had Jehoshaphat in it.
Yeah.
So where did jumping Jehoshaphat come with? I thought maybe there would be some kind of a reference to him jumping somewhere or doing something like that.
I don't know. I'll have to look it up. I'm not sure.
I always wondered about that. Every time we'd read his name, I think, where did that come from?
And you'd think it would be biblical, because where else are you going to find the name Jehoshaphat? But I don't.
Right, exactly.
I don't think there was any mention of him jumping or anything. So
no, I don't think so. Okay, never mind. Go ahead. Sorry.
In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also in a written edict declared. Remember, I talked about the Cyrus cylinder. So this was a written edict that I've seen in person, which is kind of cool. Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem and Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And that all survivors in whatever place they reside be assisted by the people of their place with silver and gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem. The heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests of the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred, got ready to go and rebuild the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. All their neighbors aided them with silver vessels, with gold, with goods, with animals, and with valuable gifts, besides all that was freely offered. King Cyrus himself brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. King Cyrus of Persia had them released into the charge of Mithridath the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar the prince of Judah. And this was the inventory: gold basins 30, silver basins 1,000, knives 29, gold bowls 30, other silver bowls 410, other vessels 1,000. The total of the gold and silver vessels was 5,400. All these Sheshbazzar brought up when the exiles were brought up from Babylon to Jerusalem. So not only did he free them, he gave them gold and silver to help rebuild their temple and rebuild the land.
That's interesting that he didn't just keep it. I mean, he didn't have to.
Right.
You know?
It's one of the things about it is Cyrus was not the one that enslaved them. So
right.
it was the king who was conquered by Cyrus.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we know that historically by outside sources too, that happened. So maybe it's interesting that he conquered the land, so he would have been entitled to whatever was in the land, but yet
Right.
he knew that some of it had been stolen. So I just think Cyrus is a fascinating character for a lot. We're going to skip the next chapter. Suffice to say, it lists all of the families of the Israelite people that returned, and I'm going to read just beginning the verse 64. The whole assembly together was 42,360, besides their male and female servants, of whom there were 7,337. And they had 200 male and female singers and 736 horses, and so on. So about 50,000 people were, give or take, were in captivity, including their own servants. They had servants with them to fight in captivity. They're slaves, but their slaves had slaves. And then it says, and they came back to Jerusalem according to the resources they gave to the building fund: 61,000 derricks of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly robes. So they came back, and the first thing they did was put into a fund all this gold and silver that they had, and because restoring the temple was important. I'll say on the Cyrus cylinder, it never names the people by name, unlike what it said here. It never says, "And I will release the Hebrew people," right? It does the Hebrew, but it says, on the Cyrus cylinder, it says, "I'll release all of those who have been enslaved by the Babylonians," which was probably not just the Israelites, not just the Hebrew people, but other people also. So it's when it said that thing at the beginning, well, he said it said King Cyrus is releasing them to build the temple again. I don't know how historic that is unless it was a verbal declaration, but not to take anything away from what Cyrus did. It was the first ever Emancipation Proclamation, if you think about it. Slavery existed for thousands and thousands of years.
Mhm.
And Cyrus is the first one we know of that said, "I'm going to let them be free again," which is pretty. Like, there's no reason, like you said, there was no reason for him to give the gold back. There's no reason
Right.
for him to have to free the slaves either. But he did. So pretty amazing. So we're going to continue here, chapter 3. Some interesting stuff happens. When the 7th month came and the Israelites were in the towns, the people gathered together in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, with his fellow priests. I'm just going to make a funny aside. You know, when people name their kids biblical names, they always name them like David and Joshua and Mary and stuff like that. How come they never name them Jozadak and Zerubbabel?
Right.
I mean, come on. I remember Muppim and Huppim, the twins.
Or Jehoshaphat. Shoot, why not?
I know. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, with his kin, to set out to build the altar of the God of Israel, and to offer burnt offerings on it, as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring people, and they offered burnt offerings upon it to the Lord, morning and evening. And they kept the festival of booths as prescribed, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the ordinance, as required for each day. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, offerings at the new moon, and at all the sacred festivals of the Lord, and offerings of everyone who made a free will offering to the Lord. Remember, the Babylonians destroyed the temple. So it's destroyed in 586 BC. So the temple doesn't exist right now. So they put up a altar roughly where the original altar had been, but there's no temple. Right? Who knows what was occupying that space, but the temple was destroyed 70 years before, well, actually more than that, probably almost 100 years before this. So we don't, it's interesting that they put up an altar, and it says that line, they were in dread of the neighboring peoples. But because I think the implication is the people that stayed behind sort of lost their faith to a certain degree. They drifted away from their regular faith because they had no temple to go to. From the verse 6, from the first day of the 7th month, they began offering burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. So they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the Sidonians and the Tyrians, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the grant that they had from King Cyrus of Persia. To the grant, you hear that? he gave them funds, and it's a grant. I love that. We're talking about words we use in church. What was it? He said, oh, there was a line there where he said something about he had the treasure. He had the treasure give them something. Oh yeah. King Cyrus, this is in the first chapter. King Cyrus of Persia had them released into the charge of Mithridates the treasurer, who counted out the stuff. And now we have this talk about the resources they gave, to rebuild the temple. So, for the offerings and the money, and yeah, kind of like building a roof on a church, replacing a roof on a church.
Yes, yes.
There are some parallels there, I think.
Well, maybe Cyrus figured that the Hebrews would be better neighbors than the Babylonians, and that's why he supported them. You think? Maybe they would not be as pushy.
As violent, yeah.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. Verse 8. In the second year after their arrival at the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel and Jeshua son of Jozadak made a beginning to gather the rest of their people, the priests and the Levites and all who had come to Jerusalem from that captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upwards to have the oversight of the work on the house of the Lord. And Jeshua with his sons and his kin, and Kadmiel and his sons, Binui and Hodaviah, along with the sons of Henadad, the Levites, their sons and kin, together took charge of the workers in the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments were stationed to praise the Lord with trumpets. And the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals according to the directions of King David of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord. For he is good, and for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people responded with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted so loudly that the sound was heard far away. So some people wept, and I don't necessarily think from joy. It's interesting.
Yeah, I was questioning why were some of them weeping.
Well, it says the older ones were weeping, right?
Because
the younger ones were shouting for joy.
Yeah.
So maybe the older ones were just weeping with joy.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's a note here. I'm just not.
Oh, okay. Here, mine says, shouts of joy, sounds of weeping. The people of Israel were accustomed to showing their emotions in visible and audible ways. That's all it says.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. The other thing that hits me now is it almost sounds like there's conflict with the people that stayed behind. It's almost like the story of the people of Israel is only the story of the elites and not of the people that stayed behind. Because there's this, well, they're laying it in the midst of all the other people, but it's them. It's them versus us, which is interesting. Even though the rest of the people are part of the holy people, part of the chosen people. So
yeah.
I
think that division too, though, carried clear on up till the time of Jesus, because you had more than one class system.
Yeah.
You had the Sadducees, you had the Pharisees, you had the common man.
You had the Essenes. You had 3 groups of priestly groups. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Chapter 4. When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of families and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the heads of the families in Israel said to them, "You have no part with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus of Persia has commanded us." Then the people of Judah of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. And they bribed officials to frustrate their plan through the reign of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of King Darius of Persia. It's interesting that they're doing this on behest of King Cyrus, right? Even though they're not in the land that was Babylon anymore. And it sounds also like this, the people that are here are, these are people that had been brought in, but not originally Hebrew people. So these people that worship the Hebrew God, but came in during the Assyrian invasion and exile. And it's interesting that they don't want. Sometimes the issue is they may worship the God of the Hebrews, but they also worship other gods, and they don't want that to be muddied. You know, it's hard to say why they told them they weren't allowed to be with them. Said, "We don't want, no part. You have no part with us." My Bible says it's the people who were imported colonists from other parts of the Assyrian Empire to settle in northern Israel after the deportation of many inhabitants. So people that were brought in and settled in the land and presumably worshiped the Hebrew gods, but probably also had their own culture, their own religion.
Okay, so the priests that came back and were involved in building of the temple, were they the ones that became the hierarchy that was prevalent in the time of Christ?
Probably, yeah. I mean,
Because they were the elite that had been carried off.
Yeah,
right.
The people that left and came back were the landowners, the elite, right? And so they're also the leaders of the temple, the Levite, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Was that about when the time that the tradition of the synagogues began to be formed and started, or was that later?
I would say probably around now, and the only reason for that is it's an interesting question, because the problem with pre-Babylonian exile worship for the Hebrew people is it's so centrally located, right? In a way, they say, well, God exists everywhere, but mainly in the temple. And so if you're worshiping anywhere else, it's fine, but it's more effective in the temple. And God literally sits in the temple. God, the holy seat, the Ark of the Covenant is the holy seat. So God's literally in the temple. So if you worship anywhere else, it's fine, but it's not good enough, right? So that when the temple is destroyed, they didn't believe the temple could be destroyed when it's destroyed the first time by the Babylonians. So I suspect after they return, which is now, that the idea of, now the synagogues are still not the holy temple, right? They're still not the seat of the worship. But if your whole religion is tied up in, this is going to sound like a modern conversation. If your whole religion is tied up in one building, and that building is destroyed, what happens to your faith? Right? If to a certain degree, the Hebrew people worship the building, worship the temple. And so when the temple is destroyed, I imagine, we don't know what happened really in the meantime, but we know that synagogues exist after this, right? And I don't think it's even mentioned before this. So I'm guessing the temple the destruction of the temple the first time, because it does get destroyed again, was sort of a reminder that maybe they needed to have other outposts for God. Now, granted, even when there's synagogues, people would still make pilgrimage to the temple, and we know that for sure. Like the Passover time, Jesus, the day of Jesus' crucifixion, Simon of Cyrene was in town on a pilgrimage to go to the temple. So it's still central for their faith, but there are synagogues later on. There are churches at the time of Jesus, right?
Do you feel like that sometimes that that attitude carries over into our worship of God to this day?
Yes. Yeah. I kind of implied that a second ago. I think we worship the building more. We think that the building is God.
Yeah.
God is the building. And I had a lot of pushback when we said, well, we're going to worship the parking lot. People said, well, it's not worship if it's not inside. And I'm like,
Yeah. It was some of the most memorable services I ever attended was that camp meeting on top of a mountain.
right.
And then the worship, the original tabernacle was an old circus tent.
I really believe that it's not that the building isn't important. I think for me, COVID helped me determine why the building is important. The building is like a magnifying glass. The building is a focus, right?
Yes.
It doesn't mean we can't worship somewhere else. We can worship in the parking lot. We can worship in nature. We can worship, at the mall. But the building helps everything come into focus better because we have the objects we can look at. We have the cross, we have flowers, we have the altar, but it doesn't mean that God is more present in the church than in the parking lot.
That's
So
right.
that's where we've conflated it. And the Jewish people really believe that God was more present in the temple than anywhere else. Even more present in the synagogues. But I think we have remnants of that today. I think people worship the building. For better or for worse, they think God is. No one will ever say it out loud, but people think God is more present inside the building than in the parking lot. Even though we don't believe that theologically or practically, that's what that's how we think. So there's a friend of mine who's a pastor in our synod, who is part of I'm going to forget the name of it, what it's called, but it's the open church movement, and it's churches that are intentionally designed to be not in a building, that they're a full church but no physical structure. They worship outside, and that's all they do. That's their whole thing. So there's a movement. There's a number of churches that are in that movement that have stepped away from that and worship in an outside and outdoor space. And what happens when it gets cold? Then they get tents but mostly they're in places where it doesn't get too cold. So
well, I know of such a congregation in Albuquerque because my 95-year-old friend up there that I talk to regularly, his son plays the music for them.
Yeah.
Every Sunday. And most of it's outdoors.
I think that's very healthy. Right? I mean, how much of our money is tied up in maintaining this building?
Right.
Right. And what could we be doing with that money instead? So we're going to continue here, verse 6.
Okay.
In chapter 4. In the reign of Ahasuerus, in his ascension year, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam and Mithridath and Tabeel and the rest of their associates wrote to King Artaxerxes of Persia. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. So there are people that are opposing I said this before, how there's bound to be conflict when people are moving back into the land where some people never left, right? Rehum, the royal deputy, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes. Okay. As follows. Then Rehum, the royal deputy, Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of their associates, the judges, the envoys, the officials, and the Persians, the people of Erech, the Babylonians, the people of Susa, that is, the Elamites, and the rest of the nations whom the great and noble Osnapper deported and settled in the cities of Samaria and the rest of the province beyond the river wrote. And now this is a copy of the letter that they sent. There's a lot of a lot of preface to this. This is the letter. So people that weren't among the people that were exiled are writing a letter to the new king of Persia.
And also these people were totally surrounding them.
Yeah.
If you read, the different Babylonian, the Persians,
Yeah,
Elamites, all those people were surrounding them. They didn't want them to be, I think they probably didn't want them to start getting too strong.
right. To King Artaxerxes, your servant, people of the province beyond the river, send greeting. And now may it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now may it be known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be reduced. Now because we share the salt of the palace, and it is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor, therefore we send and inform the king, so that a search may be made in the annals of your ancestors. It will discover in the annals that this is a rebellious city, hurtful to kings and provinces, and that sedition was stirred up in it from long ago. On that account, this city was laid waste. We make known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls finished, you will then have no possession in the province beyond the river. Wow. But see, you notice that they are doing this at the behest of King Cyrus, right? So it's almost as if we returning to our home, but we're doing it not just with the king's blessing, but under the king's guidance. Right?
It sounds like King Cyrus isn't in control anymore. Now it's King Artaxerxes.
Yeah.
From Persia, right?
Yeah. And I think they're jumping a little bit too. The king sent an answer to Rehum, the royal deputy, and Shimshai the scribe, and the rest of their associates who live in Samaria and in the rest of the province beyond the river. Greeting. And now the letter that you sent to me has been read in translation before me. So I made a decree, and someone searched and discovered that this city has risen against kings from long ago, and that rebellion and sedition have been made in it. Jerusalem has had mighty kings who ruled over the whole province beyond the river, to whom tribute, custom, and toll were paid. Therefore issue an order that these people be made to cease, and that the city not be rebuilt, until I make a decree. Moreover, take care not to be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king? Then when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and the scribe Shimshai and their associates, they hurried to the Jews in Jerusalem and by force and power made them cease. At that time, the work on the house of God in Jerusalem stopped and was discontinued until the second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. Interesting. Stop rebuilding. When you have a town, you're too annoying.
Yes, definitely.
That's kind of.
And you don't want to send us your tribute, and you just want to be annoying. Actually,
you're making the rest of us nervous when you rebuild Jerusalem.
Uh-huh.
All right, we're gonna read chapter 5, and then we're gonna probably end there. Now the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, we've heard them, by the way. There are books in the Bible. Who are post-exilic, obviously. Sons of Iddo prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, set out to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and with them were the prophets of God helping them. At the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus: Who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish the structure? They also asked them this: What are the names of the men who are building this building? But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until a report reached Darius, and then answer was returned by letter in reply to it. The copy of the letter that Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai and his associates, the envoys who were in the province beyond the river, sent to King Darius. They sent him a report in which was written as follows: Darius did succeed Cyrus. I don't know who the other one was, but Darius succeeded Cyrus. To Darius the king, all peace. May it be known to the king that we went to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. It is being built of hewn stone, and timber is laid in the walls. This work is being done diligently and prospers in their hands. When we spoke to those elders and asked them, who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish the structure, we also asked them their names for your information, that we may write down the names of the men at their head. This was their reply to us. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the house that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished. But because our ancestors had angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried away the people to Babylonia. However, King Cyrus of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, made a decree that this house of God should be rebuilt. Moreover, the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem and had brought into the temple of Babylon, these King Cyrus took out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered to a man called Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. He said to him, take these vessels, go and put them in the temple of Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its site. Then this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem, and from that time until now it has been under construction, and is not yet finished. And now, if it seems good to the king, have a search made in the royal archives there in Babylon, and see whether a decree was issued by King Cyrus for the rebuilding of this house of God in Jerusalem, that the king send us his pleasure in this matter. This is brilliant if you think about it, right?
Mhm.
Yes, it is. Uh-huh.
Yes.
Because a letter gets sent to the people saying, don't let them rebuild the temple, don't let them rebuild the city, because they're going to be a rebellious and hurtful place. And then another letter gets sent saying, well, the king told us to, you, or the former king told us to rebuild the temple, our temple. So how are you going to argue with your own decree? Right. It's kind of a master stroke.
And luckily, somebody kept records, and they didn't
Luckily-
have to be in Annals of the King after all. They actually have them.
Luckily, they kept records, exactly. Now we have a little time. We can maybe get. I know we can't finish the book. There are some names, list of names toward the end of it, but let's go into chapter 6 a little here anyway. Then King Darius made a decree, and they searched the archives where the documents were stored in Babylon. But it was in Ecbatana, the capital in the province of Media, that a scroll was found on which this was written. A record. In the first year of his reign, King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem, that the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices are offered and burnt offerings are brought. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits, with 3 courses of hewn stone and 1 course of timber, that the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Moreover, let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple in Jerusalem, each to his place. You shall put them in the house of God. Now you, Tattenai, governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-Bozenai, and you, their associates, the envoys of the province beyond the river, keep away. This is Darius.
Really?
They tried to sneak in, but it didn't work. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. The cost to be paid to these people in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river.
God.
So he's saying, use your money to help rebuild it, even though you
Yes.
don't build.
Yes.
If you are loyal subjects of mine, you will use your money to help rebuild the temple that you don't want built.
Mhm.
That's special. Whatever
God works in mysterious ways.
whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, or sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests in Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifice to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his children. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of the house of the perpetrator, who then shall be impaled on it.
Ooh.
The house shall be made a dunghill, May the God who has established his name there overthrow any king or people that shall put forth a hand to alter this or destroy this house of God in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all diligence. Wow.
In other words, make it so.
Help pay for this. Help pay for the animals for the thing. And if you oppose it, I'm going to make sure that you're impaled on a beam from your own house. And these
Really?
are people that were opposed to the building of it at all. That's pretty strong. I love it. They sent a letter. The letter got sent back. They sent another letter. A letter got sent back. They're protesting. That is not working.
Yeah. They probably should have just kept their mouths shut.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Then, according to the word sent by King Darius, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar, Bozani, and their associates did with all diligence what King Darius had ordered. So after all their protests, they said, all right, we'll listen to King Darius. So the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. They finished their building by command of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of tribes of Israel. Then they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their courses for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. On the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. For both the priests and the Levites had purified themselves, all of them were clean. So they killed the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, and for their fellow priests and for themselves. It was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by all who had joined them and separated themselves from the pollutions of the nations of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. With joy they celebrated the festival of unleavened bread 7 days, for the Lord had made them joyful, and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. It's interesting that I'm beginning to realize that the people that stayed behind drifted from the faith, because it said they celebrated Passover, and with those few that didn't have themselves polluted by the time in between by other lands and other a lot of the story of the chosen people is the story of them drifting away.
Mhm.
And then it must have been really hard to stay on the path when they didn't have all the leaders and the temple was destroyed. We're going to end there because I have a meeting right at 11 that I can't miss.